Hello to our online audience. My name is Stephen Jones. I'll be your moderator this evening for our speaking engagement on racism on film. To my immediate right is my good man here, Yassine Kamoudi. He is one of the founders of the New Producers Academy. And I have Naomi White, or Naomi Witt. She's a filmmaker based out of Amsterdam. So please give a round of applause for my two panelists. I wanted to see if I could get from either of you, of course, you can start with your initial thoughts after screening Birth of a Nation or Birth of, this wonderful film we just saw. So.
My initial thoughts were, I actually analyzed The Birth of a Nation for my graduation thesis. And again, like I hadn't seen the imagery from that film for a couple of years, but again, seeing it, I was very shocked by, as they mentioned in the film, of still how like impactful and how emotional those scenes still are, even though it's very old material. So
a film that's produced in 1915, that's still in 2020, when was it, 2020? I guess, probably 100 years later, still being used as an educational tool. And what I find ironic about it is that, as Spike Lee mentioned in the film, the context is what is not discussed in the classes. It's simply, look at this film, it's wonderful editing, it's groundbreaking, he's using different techniques and technology, but the actual context of the film and the subject matter is usually overlooked by many people. I'm not sure, I can't speak on it because I didn't go to film school here in Amsterdam, but was the context of the film discussed at all?
I didn't go to film school either.
Okay.
I went to an art academy, but in Maastricht. But I've heard from people of color who went to film schools, also Dutch film schools, that it was still shown and there was like no context provided for like the imagery. So yeah, that's quite shocking.
Quite relevant, okay.
Yeah.
And Yassine, what were your initial thoughts on the film?
Well, although we are more than 100 years later in the future, it's still really bad to see that back in 1915, marginalized minorities were antagonized by filmmakers, and that's still something that's going on in the industry, and that's still something that I'm trying to fight for to combat. So I really like the documentary, but unfortunately, although we are more than 100 years later, we're still facing the same issues as back then.
Okay. I really appreciate your perspective. Being part of the New Producers Academy, I find it a great organization, and I wanted you to expound a little bit more on what that is and what your aim is for that organization.
So I grew up in the southern part of the Netherlands, Roosendaal, a small city in Brabant. And growing up with Dutch TV, films and series, I saw my peers always being portrayed either as a criminal trying to fight his way up into the drug industry, or some fundamentalist who needs to blow himself up halfway through the story. And I always was wondering to myself, is this the only two options I have as a Dutch Moroccan to grow up to? And while I was working in the film industry, I encountered my two co-founders, Claudio Monteseo Casillas and Loretta van Horst, on several occasions on film festivals. And we were always talking about the need of diverse producers in the industry, especially in the Dutch industry, because producers are the gatekeepers of the industry. They decide where the money goes to, where to apply to certain funds, and especially also to say who is in the project or not. And instead of protesting on the Malieveld in The Hague with our cardboards, we thought, we are crazy enough to think that we can change the industry. So let's combine our energies, let's work together, and let's actually do something and change the industry from within at the spot that's most necessary, and that is at the spot of the gatekeepers, the producers. So that's actually why we started the New Producer Academy, and it's going fairly well now.
I like the idea of instead of asking for a seat at the table, build your own table. Naomi, I had a question for you. You made we spoke a little bit about the film before we got here, and there was the point where we discussed Ira Gallen's comment. He's the archivist who said, you couldn't just help it. You want to get up and start killing somebody. You want to expound on what you told me about that?
Yeah, I don't know what's in Ira Gallen's mind, but I was really baffled by this comment because he seems to be suggesting that, like, as an audience, you have no defense mechanism whatsoever to what you are seeing in front of you, and I think, like, an audience, we aren't just like zombies, like watching the film. We can reflect on it. We take our own perspectives with it, and it's an interaction between what's portrayed on screen and the mind of the viewer. So I was thinking, okay, I think in case of The Birth of a Nation, Griffith was playing on a feeling he was already noticing in society, and he used that as for his film to make his propaganda film. So I think it was an interaction that's a bit more complex than just, kind of directing people what to do with your film.
I was shocked when I saw some of the imagery, especially the fact that they did have African Americans in the film. But then in certain instances, I noticed specifically that they used men in blackface and women in blackface in order to play certain roles. And I know that just from the history of being an African American, or an African in America, I should say, there are many roles that they would not take because it would possibly cost them their lives. And in this particular film, I know that the subject matter was extremely sensitive to many of those people, and that led them to not taking those roles. It was specifically, they mentioned it was a grand spectacle, and that the film in this sort of way was where your fears and your fantasies could be realized. And I think the main fear that people had was that the world was changing around them and that they did not have the direct control that they would like over themselves and over the people they had control over before, meaning the black population in the country. And I know that with your films, Naomi, can you speak about how you are trying to take control and maintain control over the images through your films and through your work?
I'm kind of doing it in two different ways. Mm-hmm. As a director, I've noticed I've made more of an independent production, but that was just really hard to get off the ground. That took a lot of energy and actually took a lot of away from my artistry and like my position as a director. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, I am working with Dutch broadcasters, and I'm trying to like get as many people like behind me on my team who understand my perspective, mm-hmm. And to try to like discuss and explain my position and my topics as well as I can. Mm-hmm. So that is more of a dependent role. But I'm also part of this collective called Framing of Us. We're like a collective of women of color filmmakers. Mm-hmm. And we organize events at film festivals about diversity and inclusion, and on how, especially the gatekeepers of the industry that you work with, how they can implement more diversity in the whole system. Because kind of the problem that I'm facing as a director is that there's a lot of attention for diversity and inclusion in the artistic part of the craft, but still like in the more gatekeeper part, like the broadcasters and the producers, is generally still a very white, heteronormative, mm-hmm. Male-dominated industry.
Okay. Yeah. I noticed in the film, and I've watched it maybe, 15 times now, there was a specific part where they said things changed. They had the peephole I think it's there's some sort of peephole cameras that they could watch films, and they were short films where everyone could be involved, and they said there was a certain level of equality in those films, meaning that there could be black actors or black dancers, and there were sometimes white dancers or other sorts of motion that would be in the screen, and those were basically private because they could only be seen by one person at a time. And then afterwards, once the peepholes were no longer used, and they had the arrival of projection where more than one person would be seeing the video at the same time, that is when the stereotypes became more acceptable and more produced. And I wanted to see, from your perspective, did you notice that as well when they said that in the film? And how does that, I guess, translate to what you're trying to do now?
Well, stereotypes are still a thing in films and series and in culture overall. What you need to do is try to find a safe place for makers, writers, whatsoever, that can actually understand the nuances of certain cultures. For instance, if I want to tell my story about my grandfathers, of my grandparents, they need to understand where they came from. Growing up, especially in the Netherlands, I always grew up with my grandfather's story. And he was working in the mines, in factories, just trying to provide for his family and to build a better future for them. And that's not really a cool story to tell to people, especially if there are other white grandfathers who are working in bands, traveling the world, stealing hearts of big crowds and whatsoever. So it's really important to make sure that, especially at the top, people who are the gatekeepers of the industry do understand the nuances of certain cultures, to make sure that, for instance, Naomi can tell the story nuanced, but also really truthfully, that she feels safe to tell whatever she wants to tell, instead of trying like, yeah, your story is good, but let's put some more criminality in this story. Let's make him a guy who's trying to hustle for a living, and let's make it more
exciting.
Exciting, indeed.
And also, in certain cases, people believe that that's more believable, and that's also sad as well. I remember in the film, William Monroe Trotter, they use this word with him several times because he just felt, it's an unbelievable story there that I remember. He's graduating from Harvard. He's graduated as the president of his class. He's all these accolades. And when he steps out of the university and he gets into the quote unquote real world, he's viewed, because he is proud of himself and takes no, what for an answer, he's viewed as a radical. And they mention that word several times in the film. They say, hey, Trotter was a radical simply because he stood up for himself and he stood up for his people. This is a guy that they said, he believed that his fate was tied to that of his people. That when they rose, he rose. And likely when they sunk, he sunk with them. And I find that just a powerful statement where we feel that, he had a lot of weight on his shoulders in terms of his life, his love, his commitment to his people, his commitment to his organizations, the things that he wanted to do. Do you feel any of that pressure, being the voice? I mean, his voice in his media was the newspaper, but your voice is now the film. And as I said in the film as well, the film is probably the most powerful media that we have going now. Do you feel any of that pressure in the films that you are trying to put out? Or do you like, I don't want to think about that?
To be honest, I used to. When I was in art school, I was like the only student of color in my class. But as I've moved out of that space, I've met so many filmmakers of color, queer filmmakers. I honestly feel like I'm part of a movement and part of a collective, and it's something that I really see a lot in my generation, that we have the awareness that we need each other to grow and to move forward, and it's not like an individualistic shiny.
Well, I'm glad that you can draw strength from that, because
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
that's very important. That's one of the solutions that can counteract some of these films, and the legacy of Birth of a Nation is, I think, is tied, and we can combat it with feeling that we're together and can work together. What about you, man?
Well, especially that's also one of the things that we were considering when setting up the new producer academy, is that a producer doesn't only need the skills to be a producer. And for instance, how to make a financial plan, how to get a team together, whatsoever. But what also is really important to make sure that these people get the means necessary to develop themselves to become the producer they want to become, instead of being forged by the industry itself. So a huge part of the whole new producer academy is actually totally focusing on the personal development of these producers, to make sure that we can give them the means to develop themselves as a producer they want to become. Because what we don't want to do is, at the end of the trajectory, deliver producers who are telling the exact same really stereotypical stories about their own culture, that is going to be really weird. So that's especially something, there's a lot of burden on the shoulders of the people, and the industry is looking to you, especially as a producer whatsoever. And it's also really good to actually give them the means necessary to develop themselves and to make sure that they feel safe and empowered to tell their own stories.
Okay, I think that's the proper way to go. There are several organizations and instances in history where I can see where separation has been sewed into the fabric of society, and it's left us with very little choices and very little movement and improvement in the choices and the things that we have. So I'm really glad to see that you're both working on projects that can bring more voices to the table and bring more vision to the table from different perspectives. I also want to go into, I guess, questions from the audience in a little while. So I'm going to make sure that we have this on a good time schedule. We have about 25 minutes left. So I want to make sure if there's any questions or comments from the audience about the film itself or about their organizations, please feel free. Anyone? Anyone? Yes. There's a microphone coming. You don't have to stress your voice.
Should I hold it? Okay. I think part of the reason why this Birth of a Nation was so successful as a movie was because it was telling a story that the majority wanted to hear, right? The majority was the whites, and they were projected as heroes and, fearing the blacks who might harm them. So how do you go about, making a movie where you tell a story that the majority may not want to hear, or that will push them to reflect very critically upon themselves? I mean, how do you do that in a way that you don't get shut out or completely marginalized?
That's a good question. The thing is, the first thing I want to say is that actually often I think that the majority maybe doesn't just want to see themselves projected on screen. When I grew up with mainly American movies. I think like most of us, like mainly Hollywood-based movies. Because that was like fed to the majority of us who grew up in the West. But then when I started researching films from Africa, films from Asia, I realized, hey, I can empathize just as well with characters who don't necessarily look like me. So that's something I'm always trying to remember, is like at the end of the day, I'm telling like a human story. I'm telling a story like about emotions, something that probably everyone can relate to. so when I emphasize that when I'm trying to get a film made, like with a producer or anything, I always try to emphasize like the human emotional part of it that everyone can understand. And often it works. It's something that is recognized even when you're trying to essentially sell your story to people who don't have your perspective. So I think that's something from a position of a filmmaker that I can do. But generally, I think it's like the larger structure that needs to change, like also within broadcasting companies, that need to kind of be more daring and show stories from many different perspectives and not just the majority of people that might or might not live in the country.
That's actually something I want to add on, because that's the whole power of stories. You don't have to look like the people who are being portrayed in the stories to actually understand how they feel or to understand the situations they are in. And we were just talking about one of my favorite series that are ongoing right now, which is Atlanta. And there are many, many scenes that are probably really recognizable for African Americans. But also even to me, you know, going into a house with a white professor talking about your culture like he lectures you about your own culture. Well, you grew up in their own culture, or you didn't understand it. So the power of stories are in exactly that. You don't have to look like, feel like, or you don't have to look like the person who's portraying it. So I don't believe that we need to tell a story that the majority of the audience wants to hear, because if you're a kick-ass storyteller, they will look at your story and they will recognize themselves into that story. The only thing we have to be really cautious about is that we don't use stereotypes to marginalize people or just to antagonize minorities. For instance, in this documentary, what we saw really well is how African Americans were antagonized from the start on. They were actually the problems imported to America who disunified a country. They didn't want to come to America. There was no one asking them and inviting them. Hey guys, we're setting up this new country. We have some jobs opening. Please come on. You'll get paid or whatsoever. They were brought into the United States, and they didn't really have a say whatsoever. So I really think that it's really important to understand. Like, you know, if you want to tell a story, please make sure you understand the context and the nuances of certain cultures.
But I do have to say that I think that's easier for filmmakers from the West and from the global North, generally, because I've talked to this filmmaker. Her name is Dalia Al-Khoury. She's from Syria. She's like she's like a very good, renowned filmmaker. In the Middle East, but that when she wants to show her films, which are often about the female perspective, the Arabic perspective, and she wants to show her film at festivals, especially in the US, she encounters like white male producers telling her, no, I don't think this is what a woman from Syria would think. I don't think that's, you know, they're lecturing her on her perspective. So it's not, there are still like definitely like a lot of steps to take when you look at the problem globally. But as a filmmaker from like here from the West, I am noticing indeed what you're saying, that if you emphasize like the nuances and the humanness, that you can get stories to go through.
Any other questions? I think, there's one there. Yes, sure, no problem.
Hello. Oh, okay. Actually, I have two questions separate. You talked about African and Asian films, and I was wondering, I'm not a big film watcher, but will they use the Stereotypes Reversed?
Not necessarily reverse. It's really
make white people the bad people in a movie. That makes sense.
Well, it depends on the film. There's so many different stories in those. You know, it's very large parts of the world. So many different stories. within those contexts. But I don't know, what I realize when watching movies from different parts of the world is that it's not just that it's such an entirely different perspective in like almost every detail of the film. Maybe the best way I can explain it is this Senegalese film I saw. What's this? I forgot the filmmaker's name, but in many films from West Africa, for example, the like farm animals play like prominent roles, and also like the how they are killed, basically. And I realized that I was like shocked as someone from the West, like, oh my God, why are they showing this? But then I realized, yeah, I live in this sanitized world where I don't get to see those things. That's why it's shocking to me. So it's really a perspective from a whole, it really radically changes your perspective and the way you see the world, the way you understand language. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question well, but it's just you realize how you've been watching a very straightforward Western narrative basically your whole life, and that there's so many ways to tell a story and to construct a film.
I think also it also can be affected by whether and by who that country or that area or region may have been colonized, or whether it has been colonized or not. I think that also plays a role in how the story is told, how it is developed, and whether or not they are still under that societal colonization mindset, and then how does it affect the way that they produce their art? Is their culture affected? How is their culture affected by the colonization or not? In terms of their resources, and also in terms of, I mean, in different cultures, in different places, there's humor that's maybe funny here in Europe, but it may not be funny in sub-Saharan Africa, and vice versa. Same thing with romance, same thing with any sort of emotion that you're trying to express in film. Bollywood wouldn't be Bollywood without certain elements, but we don't see that translate to maybe a film in Canada. So there are different factors at play in that regard, I think. Yeah. What, do you have a second question? Yeah, be greedy. Go ahead. Be greedy.
Oh, sorry. Okay, this is a different question, but you mentioned in Film Academy, it's the Birth of a Nation is still used as an educational tool.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe technically it's a very good movie, but is there no other equivalent? Do they still have to get back to this, or are they better now emphasizing it, or was this the only movie?
Well, remember, has anyone heard of this movie? How many people have heard of this movie before? Okay, great. I'm glad everyone's heard. Well, many people have heard of it. How many of you are film students? Okay, I was wondering if you saw it as part of your curriculum or something. This film is literally the very first Hollywood blockbuster of all time. It's the first one. So it being the first one, it then set the precedent for everything that came after it. The techniques, I'm going to list this is a documentary, so they did these interviews. I'm going to just list some of the adjectives describing D.W. Griffith, okay? Great innovator, tells stories brilliantly by editing, influential. He found stars. He made a remarkable cast. He imagined film on a larger scale. He was incredibly ambitious, okay? None of these things mention his racism. And these are people today, 2017 when the film came out, these are the comments in the film, in the documentary we just watched, Birth of a Movement. These are the comments listed given to Griffith. The only people that mention his racism are Spike Lee and a few other people, Jelani Cobb and some others. So This is a man who used Ride of the Valkyrie with dun 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 dun. Dun. Okay, now that was he transformed it or repurposed it and made Ride of the Klansman, and he used an anti-Semitic composer for that. He based his movie on the book The Klansman and then redid the title to get more support for it and to say, look, this is going to be the rebirth after Reconstruction when after the Civil War and we had more people of color having more powerful positions. We're going to retake the country, make America great again. We're going to make America great again by calling this thing the rebirth of our nation. So his film cannot be or should not be separated from the racism that birthed it. But in many cases, it's sterilized and only looked at in terms of the technical expertise that it offers. It's really hard to miss if you're not really looking or paying attention. It's still easy. I think they can overlook it because this is what they needed to do in order to make their country great again. This is how they were going to reclaim their nation.
I understand they use this movie also in the Netherlands in the academy.
Yes, and they still sterilize it and only focus on the technical
but
features.
Are you asking like why that is? Like how could that? Because that's pretty interesting.
Okay, so it's like the first movie in the way, and you cannot watch it without getting the racist elements. So okay, if the Academy wants to use it, you know, because it's part of film history, you only took a couple of minutes to emphasize it. It's not, you don't, I mean, it's a bit shocking to me to hear that it's only used, more for the technical great filmmaker thing and leave the rest out of it. But I'm no film student, but I find it quite shocking to hear.
Yeah, no, me too. I personally don't know why it's still in curriculums. I mean, I don't think it should be. I think what I'm guessing is that it's something that's just
it's part what they
being
call
repeated and
it's
repeated.
It's called canon, and it's called this is how we set the norm. Okay, this is how you set the norm. The norm is to accept these things, and the norm is to look at it through the lens that you're told to look at it through, and not to question the rest.
But maybe I'm pretty curious if any like film students who are in the audience who saw this film in school could maybe give like an insight on if you want. But
I want to see the hands again. How many people have seen this film before? If you're daring enough to do so, how many people have seen this film? Raise your hand, please. One person there. I know it was more than that. It was. Oh, have you heard? Okay. Have you seen the film? How many people have seen the film? Okay, one person. Did you see it online? Okay.
So I took I had a film minor in my bachelor's, and we didn't have to specifically watch this film. We watched a film that came after this by the same director, Broken Blossoms, and that had like other stereotypes and yellowface in it. But the film professor did talk about this one, and we were shown parts of it, and like we're encouraged to watch it outside of class if we wanted to, without talking about all the racist elements in class. So that really wasn't emphasized as much as it should have been, and upon watching it I saw all of that. But in the US it was an intro to film class that we had to study it.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment.
I did also watch the film during my studies of history, and that was in a class about racism, actually. So we did also watch part of the films, not the whole thing, and had to analyze it specifically looking at all the racist elements and stuff. So, I mean, I think that is de uitzondering. the exception. But it does also happen with this film, I think.
Just for context, this film in its entirety is 3 hours long. It has, I say, two movements. The first movement being the Civil War, as they said in the film. And that is the part where you see the southern slaveholding states, their warriors going off to fight. They come back after the North sends black-faced men into their area to destroy their towns and to wreak havoc, drinking, etc., chasing around women. In the second half of the film, we get to the Reconstruction. And the Reconstruction is where black people are allowed to have more rights in terms of voting. They are also elected officials, and those elected officials do the one thing that the Southern racist slave owners did not want, is to vote for a law that would allow black people to marry white people. And then once that happens, you have no choice but to then go to get the Klan to hold these people in place. But the crux of the film breaks down to one of the northern soldiers, loosely call it that. He chases after one of the pure white young daughters of the Confederacy, and he finds her attractive, but he looks basically like a beast. His clothes are ripped, his face is dark, he's wearing a Union suit, a Union soldier suit, and she flees away from him. And in order to keep herself pure, she decides to throw herself off a cliff, and she's killed by the doing so. So in order to save the day and to get revenge and retribution, the Klan are called, and they come to wreak havoc and burn, loot, kill black men and people who are involved, they believe involved in her death. After, I think one thing they did not highlight in the film enough, after this film is shown, or in the end of this film, the Klansmen in the film burn a cross in as a celebration after they have done what they needed to do, become heroes. Well, the Klan, the actual Klan, the real Ku Klux Klan, the actual people in North Carolina and in Atlanta and other places, they started to burn crosses as a result of this film. So this is a point where life imitates art instead of the other way around. They have been burning crosses on my campus in the 90s when I was in university, and they have been continued burning crosses and using the same nooses and the same themes and the same tropes and the same symbols from that film they have used into this century. Blackface is also one of the ones that they use into the century. The ideas that they support and the racism that they show is evident in every protest against Black Lives Matter or any other organization having to do with LGBTQ rights, with any organization that has to do with any sort of minority against women, etc. The list goes on and on. They will fight for what they believe is their perfect idea of the United States or any other place in the world. And that means that these white men, heterosexual men, are at the top of the protocol, and everyone else has to be subjugated or disappear. Sadly, what we find is that some people have the idea of white supremacy is not limited to only white people. So let's make that clear as well. We talked about that before, and sadly we have some people who believe in that sort of ideology. So this film directly led, this is 1915, around 1916, 1917, we have the Jim Crow laws, which were basically codes that allowed people of color to be stopped, frisked, locked up, murdered, etc., if they weren't following certain rules that were only for them. One of them being if you were outside and you were more than one person of color together, imagine that, and you were actually having a conversation. If you did not have a piece of paper that said you were in the employment of a white person, you would be arrested, etc. So those laws were in place. By 1919, which is called the Red Summer of 1919, the amount of people that were being lynched was up to 3,000 recorded lynchings per year after this film was released. These are the ones that are counted. These aren't the ones that are the sexual assaults are not counted at all. The things happened against women were not counted. We're talking simply people hanging or being killed.
Just to go to this question about how come we still show these movies and talk about these people like Griffith at in the academy. I'm in academia. I teach my students business and economics, and we too always talk about the same, scholars from the 70s, the 60s. We keep doing that over and over again because they are the established voices, right? And then there's always this argument that goes, well, yeah, sure, his theories came from plantations. Yeah, sure, there is that part to it, but we cannot judge it based on our current perspective today. We have to judge things by the way it was then, and back then, what Griffith did was just fair, And I find that a very annoying argument that always pushes down this type of critique. When you say, well, okay, we have to appreciate Griffith for his artistic talent. But no, we can also judge the other things. Mm-hmm. But you see this coming back in many areas where we want to, where we idealized an historical figure and then now cannot critique them anymore.
Right. I agree with that point. This is one of the things I wanted to bring up in terms of nothing is black and white, for lack of a better term, right? There's always shades of gray. And in this case, this is one of the reasons why I fight so hard for critical race theory. This is a direct example of why we need to look at it in context. Look at him and his work in context, not leave it out, not discuss it, but we need to look at it in context. I wanted to say one more point. We have Dixon, who is the author of the book, The Klansman, right? Who then is a friend of Griffith. They meet and discuss, and he makes the film with him. You have Wagner, who's the anti-Semite who made the music for the Ride of the Valkyrie, which is then put in the film. And then we have the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who is also a historian, and he believes that this film is like writing history with lightning. This is the group. This is the establishment that you speak of. And what I'm happy to report and discuss now is we know what the problem is. We're aware of the problem. We're aware of the issue. How do we solve it? So we have like 10 minutes left, and I'm gonna get into that. No, and in all seriousness, we talk about this phrase a lot. Sometimes I think I'm going to see a lot of nods when I say this phrase, but this is what I mean when I say representation matters. And that means not only representation in terms of this amazing actress and director and this wonderful actress and director there, okay? But it also means this brother here who is involved in making sure that producers are producing to get other voices out so that we can tell our stories in context with nuance, where we don't have to just accept certain roles and accept certain budgets and accept certain tropes as the only way and the only reason it will be the truth. And we can't gauge the success of something simply because the quote unquote wider audience will not accept it. Well, until it's produced, they won't.
But I think in terms of solution, I mean, we're not going to find a solution in 10 minutes, no. but
Girl,
but
you
I
are
think
the
it's
solution. I'm telling you, she's the solution. She's part of the solution. I'm proud of that. Yeah.
But I think it's pretty interesting, like what we were discussing, this idea of canon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why is it there? Why do we need it? Why do we keep repeating it? Why do we keep excusing filmmakers like Griffith for like, oh, we have to indeed look at it in context, etc. But to what extent?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the issue is, I don't even. That is a question that we can have, and that is a discussion that we can have. I simply feel it being more progressive to add to the canon.
Definitely.
To change the canon by being part of the canon.
Mm.
I don't necessarily, I mean, as I said, I don't want to exclude Griffith, but Griffith is not the be-all, end-all. He's not the only one. Yes, he may have been first, but we have to look at him in context. And I'm looking forward to hearing and seeing about the other films that were around that time by people of color. There's a young lady that you are very familiar with who enlightened me to a female classic composer. I don't know her if I don't have that discussion with her. So representation in that case, I think, matters. Can you speak on that really quickly?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
This is little backstory. I'm making a documentary at the moment about a classical pianist and activist called Juana Roy, who happened to be, which I didn't know before this panel discussion, who happened to be an old student of Stephen. And I'm like following her in her journey of how she can like unite her activism and her success. And she also is really challenging this idea of canons and institutions, and to what extent like we need places like universities and film schools to tell us what we need to know, I guess. Yeah, so I think that's interesting, and we can, try to see ways in which we can seek our knowledge, or what we take in, the art we take in outside of the established places.
And I think what I really appreciate about her and this documentary is that, this upcoming documentary, is that it's changing canon from within. She is aware, and she's taking on the challenge that was put before her to change the establishment and the narrative and all of those things from within it. She's an accomplished pianist, but she's also very active in trying to make sure that our voices are heard. And that, I think, is the way that we go. This gentleman is doing much of the same work in terms of making sure that producers are aware and that there are voices that we can hear. And you want to give us some comments on the organization?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, for instance, when the co-founders and myself were pitching the new Producer Academy to actually get the funds necessary to start up the academy, we were talking to producers in the Netherlands, and they were like, yeah, man, it's a great initiative, but we already have enough producers in the Netherlands. Like, if someone wants to tell the story that you are talking about, bring them to us. And I mean, you're one of the examples that a lot of storytellers, filmmakers, directors, screenwriters do want to tell their story authentically about really nuanced things, about their grandparents, maybe even a sci-fi film that's been set within a certain culture. And as soon as they go to these producers, they're like, yeah, but I don't think that the majority of the audience will understand what you're actually meaning. And that's definitely something that we are trying to break, to make sure that diversity and inclusion is not just a paper reality as it is right now in the industry. Because if you go to funds to actually apply to a fund to get some money for your film documentary, nowadays a lot of funds do require a diversion or inclusion box in the application. Even when I was working at a production company, I saw my name being used as a diversity wildcard. Like, oh, we have Yassine on the team, so we are covered in terms of diversity and inclusion. And I was like, man, this is not the way to go. I mean, I might have been much more conservative on certain themes than the people in the team. So it's definitely important to make sure that we do not only understand what the canon was, but also to make sure that we have the means necessary to expand the canon, that people can actually recognize themselves in the stories, identify themselves in the stories that are being told. So, you know, if there is even someone here in the audience or someone watching at home, and always had a dream to become a producer, to do actually try to produce documentaries, film series, please do apply yourself, because we are still looking for kick-ass producers who truly believe and have a vision to change not only the Dutch industry, but the film industry is a global industry. So if you have a kick-ass idea and you have a vision, please do apply at the New Producer Academy, because the application is still open till the April 4th. So.
Thank you for that. And Naomi, I wanted to make sure you get to plug some of the things you're involved in, if you would like to, please, before we end.
Well, the thing is, I'm working on a lot of applications for things, and I'm not supposed to talk about everything.
Tell us about it.
Excuse me.
Okay, generally I can say I'm working on films that challenge the perspective of I want to. I'm very interested and curious about perspectives that aren't my own, and I'm researching on how I can portray different perspectives in film in a way that more people feel seen. This seems super general, but that's just because I can't tell you all my secrets.
Talk to her afterwards in private. I bet you she could probably give you some more information. Okay. Any further questions? We have a few more minutes. I have one over here.
If we want to watch your old documentary or stuff you've made, how can we?
Yeah, that's a good question. How can we see your documentary if we would like to?
The documentary about the pianist that I'm developing now, by the end of the month, I know if I can make it. But when it comes out, I'm just putting it out into the universe here. You can watch it on Tweedoc, which is this Dutch documentary website, and it will also be broadcasted on the NPO.
And the previous one as well.
The previous one is currently not online, but maybe. Do we have the email addresses of the people in the audience?
I think we can get that, or I have paper here. We'll go old school and just put it here and spread the word. It's worth it. Believe me, it's worth it. It's worth it. Yeah.
I can. There's also this website. I made some short films for the Dutch TV program Art Department. And if you go to docwerk.tv, you can find some of my short films that I made for them on there.
Okay. Yep. That's good. Thank you. Any further questions, last comments about the film itself? I want to hear what you all think about the film. I mean, the documentary itself. I didn't hear too much about that. I heard some questions, but what do you think about the documentary?
I thought the documentary, what stood out for me is that there were several archivists there as well, and I think that's a very important perspective to add as well, because it's not, it's yes also creating more stages for voices to add to the canon, to create more representation of different perspectives. But I also believe, and this documentary sort of highlights it for me, that there is already a lot of people who have done things, but who are not included in the canon and who have been forgotten because people didn't look at them. Yeah. But they are there, and I'm sort of pleading for more archivists to open up these histories as well and to show us that there's not only Griffith who made movies, but there are more people who made movies that might be remembered.
Yeah. I think we all have a voice and they're all worthy. We just need to actually know where they are and be able to use them. I saw somebody's hand over here as well.
I don't know if there's time for another question, but I still have one. Because in the movie they also touched upon the fact that film is an important means to shed light on like an historic time or narrative. And they also said that racism sells, which is something that we still see, I think, in film. There's a lot of black trauma shown in movies nowadays as well. And I always feel like movies depicting like racism and black trauma make people say like that is racism, overlooking the fact that what we have here today is also racism. So oftentimes when you see films where they show slavery and stuff, they don't put in the context of the like how we got to here today, like the lines between the historical events. So how should we regard that in film, and can we use film as a means to show history if we don't get the chance to put it in context? Or can we put it in context in the film? I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are. All of you?
I can speak on that a bit. Like there's this example of I've two examples. There's this film called Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley, which is an amazing film. But for example, that one, it's just such a clever commentary on not just racism but also like neoliberalism, how it all like ties into each other, and it touches on slavery as well and the consequences of it. But that film, for example, got very little cinema rotation. And I also remember this story of the film Selma about the the cast of Selma. So it's about what year is it?
1963 or
63. Yeah.
Like
so it's about that time period, and then the cast of Selma, I think, to the premiere wore Black Lives Matter T-shirts, and they were like shunned for that. They were like it's easier for people to point towards history and go like that was now. That was then, this is now. So I think there are many great films that touch upon history, racism, like in the current day, but they get censored.
I also think, they do get censored, and that idea is still, sometimes it's even in series. What comes to mind for me right now is the first aflevering, the first in the series for The Watchmen, when they go over the race riot, which was basically the Tulsa race riot, and that first episode speaks about that race riot and how it affected the black community. And a lot of people had never, it was the 100th anniversary of that race riot a few years ago, and that came out, and people in the country don't even know their own history to know that existed or that act happened. They thought that was just part of the television show, but they were reenacting what actually happened, and they used actual footage, pictures of the area after it occurred. Another film I would suggest people watch, which puts a lot in context, is the film by Haile Gerima called Sankofa. Sankofa came out, I think, in 93, 92. But to me, it is one of the most thoughtful and just altering pieces of film I've ever seen. Sankofa is a story of a woman, African-American woman who's a model who goes to shoot on location near a slave quarters. And once she enters the slave quarters, she's taken back in time to become a slave. And she's branded and talks about her life and trials on the plantation until she's able to be able to get back. But there are so many different films that we don't know about and pieces of series and things of that nature that are very important, but we need to try to gather them so that we can support them and then support each other to create more. Yeah.
One last thing I want to say on that is something I'm also really trying to do in my films is not just portray marginalized groups as like people who are suffering, but even when racism is happens to be part of their story, to also show their strength and show that they have joy and that they have many different areas of their lives and that they're just not just this one part.
Yeah, I think that's really important to tell as well, because then it becomes just the trauma, right? Instead of it becoming the full story and the nuanced part, not just black, not just white, shades of gray, that sort of idea comes across in the stories as well. So, any other comments? Yeah? Everybody okay? Good. I'm glad. Thank you for coming. It doesn't have to end here in terms of the conversation. If you want to talk on the side, I'll be here for a few minutes before I get back on my tram. But I want to thank my panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Yassine and Naomi. I also want to thank Yolene. She's in here somewhere. There she is. Thank you for your laptop and the microphone and setting all of this up. And I want to definitely thank all of you for coming and participating and sharing and hopefully learning. And hope we're energized. And as the guy said, what did he say? I wrote it down one time. He said, what is it? What did he say here? I want to end it with this. I got to put, for every right, with all your might. That's it.